Welcome back to Explorion, where I share and build upon some of the learnings from my undergraduate and postgraduate psychology degrees. So today we're picking up with part 2 of offender profiling. I definitely recommend checking out the previous video, which I'll link down below for the first part. Let's start with how an offender's signature behaviour fits into offender profiling. Another critical aspect is the offender's signature behaviour. This is when an offender acts out violent fantasies which progress in nature, resulting in some characteristic of the murder reflecting a unique aspect played over and over in their fantasies. Signature behaviours stem from an offender's fantasies and remain consistent and unique to that individual, as identified by Keppel and Bynes in 1999 and Keppel and Walter in 1999. However, aspects of these signatures can evolve over time, as discovered by Keppel and Burns in 1997, indicating changes in the offender's technique or the involvement of multiple offenders. Now let's delve into the assumptions of profiling surrounding consistency and uniqueness. For profiling to be effective, several conditions must be met. First, the perpetrator must be consistent in their behaviour over time. This means that their criminal behaviour should exhibit identifiable patterns. Second, the profile should be able to discriminate between individuals. In other words, it should help identify specific characteristics unique to the offender. The homology assumption, which was examined by Mockross and Allison in 2002, said, for example, that if a perpetrator had murdered one way once, they will murder similarly in any future incidences. This suggests that more similar offenders, in terms of demographics and personality, within the same crime category will show more similar offence-related behaviour. Additionally, the data used for profiling must be reliable, although this can be challenging due to the unique nature of victims and their responses differing. Rather than using the signature and MO, behavioural investigators might systematically examine all sexual homicide crime scene behaviours to analyse behavioural consistencies across sexual homicide offenders' crime scenes and to evaluate whether consistent patterns are shown for behaviours unique to individual offenders. Within offender profiling, an offender profile is based on information from crime scene reports, forensic pathologist reports, detailed accounts of victim information, geographical information, and crime scene photographs. There are differences across countries and cultures in which profiling approach is typically used, with the US using FBI and the UK using clinical and investigative approaches. Let's start with the FBI approach, which classifies offenders as either organised or disorganised. On one hand, you have the organised offenders. These individuals tend to plan their crimes meticulously, demonstrate self-control, and are adept at covering their tracks. They often target strangers. What's intriguing about the organised offender is that they typically possess characteristics like intelligence, a skilled occupation, social competence, and sometimes even underlying feelings of anger or depression. If we were to categorise Lucy Letby as either an organised or disorganised offender, we would place her in the organised offender bracket. On the flip side, we have the disorganised offender. Their crimes are usually unplanned, haphazard, and often leave clues behind. They're more likely to know their victims personally. Disorganised offenders exhibit characteristics such as social inadequacy, lack of skill, being the first or last born child, living alone, and sometimes displaying signs of fear or confusion. Now let's talk about how the FBI develops profiles using these offender classifications. It's essential to note that FBI profiling often emerges from brainstorming, intuition, and accumulated wisdom gained from years of experience. These profilers are familiar with a vast number of cases. The profiling process follows a 4-stage approach, as outlined by Jackson and Beckerian in 1997. Firstly, data assimilation. This is gathering as much information as possible. Secondly, crime classification. This is determining the primary motivation behind the crime, such as sexual homicide. Thirdly, crime reconstruction. This is paying attention to seemingly trivial details that might hold crucial insights. And lastly, profile generation. This is creating a detailed picture of the type of person the investigators are looking for. Now let's examine some critique of the FBI approach. While it's widely recognised, it's not without its criticisms. Researchers like Kantar et al. In 2004 have questioned the reliability of the organised-disorganised typologies. They found that these distinctions don't hold up consistently in real cases. Kantar et al. Tested the third crime in a series for 100 convicted US serial killers. They found that twice as many disorganised as organised crime scene actions had been identified. There were also co-occurring behaviours. With organised, they found that the body was concealed 70% of the time and that there had been sexual activity 75% of the time. With disorganised, sex acts and vaginal rape both occurred 66% of the time. Most behaviours co-occur in less than 50% of crimes committed. The conclusion they could draw is that there's no real distinction between organised and disorganised. In fact, with their research showing that most behaviours co-occur in less than 50% of crimes committed, this challenges the notion of distinct profiles for organised and disorganised offenders. Additionally, the perceived usefulness of FBI profiling varies. It's important to note that only 46% of crimes profiled had been solved with information based on what offenders say. While profiles did help focus investigations and locate suspects in some cases, they were of no assistance in others. To break this down further, for the FBI profiling was found to focus the investigation in 72% of cases, locate possible suspects in 20% of cases, directly identify the suspect in 17% of cases, but only assist in prosecution of the suspect 6% of the time, and it was of no assistance in 17% of cases. There have also been accusations of heuristics and biases influencing judgments, including unconscious bias. Now let's shift our focus to the clinical approach, outlined by Copson, Baddock, Boone and Britton in 1997, which is utilised in the UK. Clinical profiling involves using experience and empirical research in clinical and forensic psychology. Its aim is to enable profilers to identify a wider and more sophisticated range of subliminal behavioural signals. Profilers in this approach look for signals of cognition, affect, emotions, moods, desires, themes like anger, power, control, which can be both overt and implicit control, and even obsessionality and any other underlying psychological influences. British profiler Britton developed 4 basic questions that guide the clinical approach. Firstly, what happened? Secondly, how was it done? Thirdly, who was the victim? And lastly, what motivated the killer or killers? Now let's evaluate the clinical approach. One critique comes from Davis and Follett in 2002, who mentioned the term intuitive profiles. These are profiles associated with criminal stereotypes and can lead to biased judgments. The term was used to associate evidentiary factors with criminal stereotypes. For example, of representative heuristic means that individuals use characteristics believed to exemplify criminals without considering the base rates or true prevalence of these characteristics in criminals or in the entire population. The unique nature of clinical profiles means techniques cannot be replicated and thus developed, and therefore they remain static as a discipline. Ainsworth in 2001 also queried as to the psychological research drawn on in order to create the profile. Moreover, some have questioned the reliance on stereotypes and pre-existing knowledge rather than solid psychological research. Thank you so much for listening to part 2. In part 3, we will look at the final profiling approach, which is known as investigative psychology. We will also look at the challenges of this approach, before lastly looking at the changes in offender profiling in the UK. See you for part 3.